It was a warm afternoon in the quiet suburb of Glenridge, where life usually moved at a peaceful pace. The kind of place where neighbors exchanged polite nods while walking their dogs and kids played basketball in driveways. But on this day, something was about to shatter that calm. A call had just come through to the local police station, and the tone of the caller's voice was sharp and urgent. "They're being suspicious," the woman on the line insisted. "They don't belong here. You need to send someone now." The caller, a woman named Patricia, had lived in Glenridge for years and considered herself the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood. She was known for her sharp tongue and judgmental glances, especially when newcomers moved in. But Patricia wasn't just watching over her community, she was watching for anyone she thought didn't fit her idea of who should live there. On the other end of her binoculars was the Carter family, James, his wife Monica, and their 8-year-old daughter Ava. They had moved into the neighborhood only a week ago, eager to settle into what they thought would be their dream home. James was a high school teacher, and Monica ran her own online baking business. They were hardworking, kind, and had always envisioned raising Ava in a safe, welcoming place. But today, that dream was about to be tested. As the family unpacked boxes in their front yard, laughing and enjoying the sunny weather, Patricia sat by her window, convinced that something about them was off. She clutched her phone tightly, muttering things to herself as she dialed. "They're just standing there," she told the dispatcher, her voice dripping with disdain. "I think they might be up to something dangerous." The dispatcher, trying to keep things professional, asked for details. "Ma'am, can you describe what's happening? Are they doing anything illegal?" They're just not from around here," Patricia stammered, her words a thin veil over her true feelings. "They don't look like they belong. I know trouble when I see it." Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled onto the quiet street, their flashing lights breaking the neighborhood's usual serenity. James looked up from the box he was holding, confused by the sudden commotion. Monica instinctively reached for Ava, her heart racing as the officers approached their driveway. "Is something wrong, officers?" James asked calmly, though his voice carried the weight of uncertainty. The officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "We received a report about suspicious activity," one of them explained, his tone more apologetic than authoritative. "Suspicious activity?" Monica repeated, her eyes narrowing. "We're just unpacking our things." As the exchange unfolded, Patricia watched from her window, a smug expression on her face. She felt justified in her actions, certain that she was protecting her neighborhood. But what Patricia didn't realize was that her decision to call the police would set off a chain of events that would lead to her own downfall. Because while Patricia was convinced she had the upper hand, the truth was about to come to light, and it was a truth that would turn her world upside down. Just as the officers were about to leave, another neighbor stepped out of their house, a phone in hand, recording everything. "Hey, what's going on here?" they asked loudly, walking toward the commotion. "Is this about the Carters? Because I've got something to say." The air grew thick with tension as everyone turned toward the neighbor. Patricia froze in her window, her confidence suddenly shaken. Whatever was about to be revealed was something she wasn't prepared for. And as the neighbor took a deep breath, ready to speak, the officers braced themselves for what was coming next. The neighbor who had stepped forward was Mr. Lyle, a retired postal worker who had lived in Glenridge for decades. He was known for his easygoing demeanor and his habit of chatting with anyone who crossed his path. He had been watching the scene unfold from his porch and couldn't sit idly by any longer. With his phone still recording, he looked at the officers, then at Patricia's window, and finally at the Carters. "This family hasn't done a single thing wrong," Mr. Lyle said firmly, his voice carrying across the yard. "In fact, I think there's something you all should know." Patricia ducked behind her curtains, her earlier confidence now replaced by a gnawing fear. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for the Carters. In her mind, she was the voice of reason, the one protecting the neighborhood from what she saw as troublemakers. But as Mr. Lyle began to speak, she realized she might have underestimated how much people were watching her, too. The officers turned their attention to Mr. Lyle, visibly relieved to hear another perspective. "Go ahead, sir," one of them said, motioning for him to continue. "You see," Mr. Lyle began, gesturing toward the Carters, "I met James and Monica just a few days ago. They're good people. We talked about their move, their plans for the house, and even about Ava starting at the local elementary school next week. There's nothing suspicious about them. They're just trying to settle in, like any family would." James gave a small nod of gratitude, but the tension in his posture hadn't eased. Monica held Ava close, whispering softly to reassure her daughter, who was wide-eyed and clutching her favorite stuffed bear. "But that's not the whole story," Mr. Lyle continued, his tone shifting. He turned his gaze toward Patricia's house. "I've lived here long enough to know when someone's up to no good. And let me tell you, it's not the Carters. It's her." The officers exchanged uncertain looks, and James furrowed his brow in confusion. Patricia, peeking from behind her curtains, felt her stomach drop. She hadn't anticipated becoming part of the spotlight. "What exactly do you mean by that?" one of the officers asked, stepping closer to Mr. Lyle. Mr. Lyle sighed, clearly grappling with how much to reveal. "I've seen Patricia pull stunts like this before. She's called the cops on delivery drivers, dog walkers, even the mailman once. It's always the same excuse: they look suspicious or they don't belong here. But we all know what she really means." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, until Monica found the courage to say them. "She means people who look like us," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Doesn't she?" Mr. Lyle nodded solemnly. "That's exactly what I mean." The officers stood still, their professional composure faltering as the weight of the situation became clearer. One of them turned back to James and Monica. "We're sorry for the inconvenience," he said, his voice tinged with genuine regret. "It sounds like there's been a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Monica echoed, her voice rising slightly. "You mean she can just call you, lie about us, and you show up with flashing lights like we're criminals? How is that a misunderstanding?" James placed a calming hand on her shoulder, but his jaw was tight with anger. "We appreciate you hearing us out," he said, his tone measured but firm. "But this is more than an inconvenience. This is our life. Our daughter's life." The officers seemed at a loss for words, their faces a mixture of guilt and discomfort. They knew the situation wasn't right, but they were bound by the report they had been called to investigate. One of them finally spoke up. "We'll make sure this is documented properly. If there's anything else we can do, please let us know." But before they could retreat to their patrol cars, another voice rang out. "Wait." It was Mrs. Alvarez, the neighbor from across the street. She walked over briskly, her face flushed with determination. "I've got something to add," she said, glancing at Mr. Lyle. "This isn't just about Patricia being nosy or overreacting. She's been harassing people for years. She watches everyone through her windows, takes pictures, writes down license plates. She even followed my teenage son to the park once because she thought he was up to something." Mrs. Alvarez's voice cracked with frustration. "Enough is enough." The officers looked toward Patricia's house, where the curtains had been drawn tightly shut. They exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that they needed to address the situation more thoroughly. Inside her home, Patricia paced nervously, the weight of the accusations pressing down on her. She had always justified her actions as being for the greater good of the neighborhood. But now, as the voices outside grew louder and the truth about her behavior came to light, she began to feel the walls closing in. And just when it seemed like the tension couldn't get any higher, another neighbor stepped out of their house. Then another. One by one, people began to share their experiences, their voices rising in a collective call for accountability. Each story painted a clearer picture of Patricia's actions, and with every word, the spotlight shifted further away from the Carters and squarely onto her. As the officers prepared to knock on Patricia's door, James and Monica exchanged a glance, their emotions a mix of relief and exhaustion. They had only wanted to start a new chapter for their family, but now, they found themselves at the center of a battle they hadn't asked for. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. The street was no longer quiet. Neighbors stood in their driveways, whispering to one another or recording the scene with their phones. The once tranquil suburb of Glenridge had become a stage for confrontation, and all eyes were on Patricia's house. The officers, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, approached her door with cautious steps. Inside, Patricia stood frozen. Her heart raced as she peeked through the blinds and saw the officers heading her way. The voices of her neighbors outside filtered in through the thin walls, each accusation cutting deeper than the last. She couldn't believe this was happening. In her mind, she was the victim, misunderstood, unfairly judged, and now cornered in her own home. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Hargrove," one of the officers called out, his voice steady but firm. "We'd like to speak with you." Patricia's hands trembled as she moved toward the door. Her mind raced with excuses, explanations, anything that might justify her actions. She opened the door just enough to see the officers, her face pale and strained. What is this about?" she asked, feigning confusion. "Ma'am," the officer began, "we've been hearing some concerns from your neighbors about repeated incidents involving false reports and harassment. We need to get your side of the story." "My side of the story?" Patricia said, her voice rising defensively. "I'm just trying to keep this neighborhood safe. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Look out for each other?" The officer nodded, his expression neutral. "Of course, ma'am. But the way you've gone about it seems to be causing a lot of distress. Your neighbors have shared multiple instances where your actions have crossed a line." Patricia shook her head vigorously. "They're exaggerating. Twisting things around to make me look bad. I only called because I saw something suspicious. That family doesn't belong here." "They don't belong here?" The words came out louder than she intended, and the officer's expression shifted, his patience thinning. "Miss Hargrove," he interrupted, "this isn't about what you think or feel. It's about the impact your actions are having on others. You've created an environment where people feel unsafe and targeted. That's not looking out for your community. That's crossing boundaries." Outside, the neighbors were growing restless. James stood near the edge of his driveway, his arms crossed tightly. Monica stayed close to Ava, who was now clinging to her stuffed bear like it was a lifeline. Mrs. Alvarez and Mr. Lyle had joined them, their presence a silent show of solidarity. Then, breaking the uneasy silence, Mr. Lyle spoke up again, this time addressing the gathering crowd. "This isn't just about Patricia," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This is about what kind of neighborhood we want to be. Do we want to live in fear of each other, or do we want to actually know each other? Respect each other?" His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the crowd seemed to consider them. James looked at him, his expression softening. Monica, too, felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, amidst all the tension, something good could come from this. But inside Patricia's house, her fear was quickly turning to anger. She felt cornered, betrayed by her own community. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped, her voice breaking. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm the one being targeted here." The officer sighed, clearly weary of her deflections. "Miss Hargrove, we're going to need you to step outside. We're conducting an investigation into the reports filed today and any past incidents. Please cooperate." Patricia's mind reeled. An investigation? This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to be the hero of this story, the one who kept her neighborhood safe. But as she looked at the crowd gathered on her street, their faces filled with frustration and disappointment, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. Still, she wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Fine," she said curtly, stepping out onto her porch. She squared her shoulders, trying to maintain an air of authority. "But I'm telling you, you're all making a mistake. That family. There's something not right about them." At her words, Monica's composure finally cracked. She took a step forward, her voice trembling but powerful. "The only thing that's not right here is you," she said. "You don't even know us, but you decided we didn't belong the moment you saw us. Do you have any idea how terrifying it is to explain to an 8-year-old why the police are at her house? To know that no matter what we do, someone like you will always see us as a threat?" Ava buried her face in Monica's side, her small frame shaking as silent tears fell. James wrapped his arms around both of them, his jaw tight as he fought to keep his emotions in check. The crowd grew quiet, the weight of Monica's words settling over them. Even the officers seemed moved, their postures softening as they looked at the Carters. But Patricia refused to back down. "You're twisting this," she yelled, her voice shrill and desperate. "I didn't mean." "Enough," Mr. Lyle interrupted, his tone sharp. "Just stop, Patricia. Everyone here knows the truth. The more you try to deny it, the worse you make it for yourself." Patricia turned to him, her face a mask of anger and disbelief. But before she could respond, one of the officers stepped forward. "Miss Hargrove, we have reason to believe your actions today constitute filing a false report. We're going to need you to come down to the station for further questioning." The crowd gasped, the tension reaching its peak. Patricia's face turned pale, and for the first time, she seemed to realize the gravity of her situation. The officers waited patiently, giving her a moment to process what was happening. James and Monica watched from their driveway, their emotions a whirlwind of relief, exhaustion, and lingering fear. They didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since they moved to Glenridge, it felt like the tide was turning. As Patricia hesitated on her porch, the crowd held its breath, waiting to see what she would do. The entire neighborhood had come to a standstill, and the question lingering in everyone's mind was the same: what would it take to finally bring the truth to light? Patricia stood frozen on her porch, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The murmurs from the crowd felt deafening, every whisper a sharp jab at her pride. Her mind raced, searching for a way to regain control, to rewrite the narrative spiraling out of her grasp. The officers waited, their expressions unreadable but firm. Patricia could feel the weight of their authority pressing down on her, and for a moment, it seemed like she might surrender. But just as she opened her mouth to respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Wait!" Everyone turned to see a man walking briskly up the street, his long strides purposeful and his face set with determination. It was another neighbor, Mr. Daniels, a tech consultant who worked odd hours and rarely made appearances at neighborhood gatherings. Most people barely knew him, but his sudden arrival added a jolt of energy to the already tense scene. "Officers," Mr. Daniels said, slightly out of breath as he reached the group. "Before you take her away, there's something you need to see." Patricia's eyes widened in surprise and hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone was here to defend her. But her relief was short-lived. Mr. Daniels pulled out his phone and swiped through a series of photos before holding it up for the officers to see. "These are from my security cameras," he explained. "I've had them installed for months because of some break-ins we had last year. And, well, they caught Patricia doing something you'll want to look at." The officers leaned in, their brows furrowing as they scrolled through the images. James and Monica exchanged wary glances, unsure of what was unfolding but feeling the tension tighten like a vice. "What is it?" one officer asked, his tone cautious but intrigued. Mr. Daniels hesitated, glancing at Patricia, who now looked as pale as a ghost. "It's her," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation. "Walking around at night, looking into people's yards. She's been spying on everyone, not just the Carters." Gasps rippled through the crowd as neighbors began murmuring to one another, their voices a mix of shock and anger. "Are you serious?" someone called out. "She's been watching all of us?" Patricia stumbled back a step, her face a mixture of disbelief and panic. "That's ridiculous," she sputtered. "I was just checking to make sure everything was safe. I wasn't doing anything wrong." But Mr. Daniels wasn't finished. "There's more," he said grimly, pulling up another video. This time, he turned the screen toward the crowd. The footage showed Patricia late at night, standing near a parked car and writing something on a notepad. It was a license plate Mrs. Alvarez's, to be exact. Mrs. Alvarez gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "You've been tracking my car?" she demanded, her voice trembling with fury. "Why? What could you possibly gain from that?" Patricia stammered, her composure unraveling further. I wasn't tracking anything. I just thought. I thought it looked out of place." "That's enough," one of the officers interjected, his tone sharper now. "Miss Hargrove, we're adding this to our investigation. Your behavior goes far beyond a single false report. It's a pattern of harassment." The crowd's energy shifted, anger and frustration boiling over as more neighbors began to share their own encounters with Patricia's intrusive behavior. One woman recounted how Patricia had questioned her landscapers for hours, accusing them of stealing. Another man revealed that she had followed his teenage daughter to the park, claiming she was skipping school. As the stories poured out, James and Monica stood silently, watching the truth about their tormentor unfold. But amidst the chaos, a strange feeling crept into James's mind, a sense that there was still more to this story, something lurking beneath the surface. He glanced at Monica, who met his gaze with the same unspoken question: why was Patricia doing all of this? Before he could voice his thoughts, another twist sent shockwaves through the crowd. A young man stepped forward, his face familiar to some but not all. He introduced himself as Marcus, a former resident who had grown up in the neighborhood but moved away years ago. "I've been staying with my parents for a few weeks," Marcus explained. "And I didn't want to get involved at first. But after hearing everything, I think you all need to know something." Patricia's breath caught in her throat, and her hands gripped the edge of her porch railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What is it?" Mr. Lyle asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. Marcus hesitated, glancing at the officers before continuing. "Patricia's been targeting families like the Carters for years. Mine included. My dad was one of the first black homeowners in this neighborhood, and Patricia made it her mission to make us feel unwelcome. She filed noise complaints, called animal control on our dog, even accused my mom of vandalizing her garden. We thought moving away would solve the problem, but clearly, it didn't." The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Marcus's words confirmed what many had suspected but were too afraid to say out loud. Patricia wasn't just nosy or overly cautious, she was prejudiced, and her actions had caused years of harm. Patricia tried to defend herself, her voice shrill and desperate. "That's a lie. I would never." But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. The truth was out, and no amount of denial could put it back in the shadows. James stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Enough," he said, his eyes locking onto Patricia's. "You've done enough." The weight of his words silenced the crowd, and for the first time, Patricia seemed to realize the full extent of her actions. But even as the officers prepared to escort her to their car, the tension in the air didn't dissipate. There were still unanswered questions, unresolved feelings, and the lingering sense that this conflict had only scratched the surface of something much deeper. And as the crowd began to disperse, James and Monica knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. As Patricia was led toward the police car, the street seemed to hold its breath. Every step she took felt heavy, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. The neighbors watched in a mix of disbelief and quiet relief, finally seeing consequences for the years of harm she'd caused. Yet, amidst the closure, an unspoken tension lingered. Something about the night still felt unfinished, as if a piece of the puzzle was missing. James stood with Monica and Ava, holding his family close as they watched the scene unfold. For the first time, they felt a flicker of safety, but it was fragile, like a flame that could be snuffed out with the wrong gust of wind. Monica's hand tightened on James's arm, and when he looked at her, he saw the unease still clouding her eyes. "Do you think this is really over?" she asked softly. James hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet," he replied. "There's something she's hiding. I can feel it. As if on cue, one of the officers who had been inside Patricia's house emerged, holding a folder and a small box. The contents seemed ordinary, but the officer's expression was anything but. He exchanged a quick, serious glance with his partner before walking over to the car where Patricia now sat, her head low and her hands shaking. "Miss Hargrove," he said firmly, holding up the folder, "we found this in your study." "Care to explain?" Patricia's eyes darted to the folder, her face draining of what little color it had left. She stammered, trying to form words, but nothing coherent came out. The officer flipped it open, revealing pages upon pages of notes, photos, and maps. It was a detailed record of not just the Carters, but nearly every family in the neighborhood. Times, dates, observations, everything meticulously documented. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs, the implications sinking in like a lead weight. Patricia had been watching them, tracking their every move, not for days or weeks but for years. "What is this?" Mr. Lyle demanded, stepping forward. "Why would you do this?" Patricia finally found her voice, though it was thin and trembling. "I was protecting the neighborhood," she said weakly. "Someone had to. You all were too blind to see the danger." "Danger?" Mrs. Alvarez shot back. "The only danger here has been you." But then, as the officer began to close the folder, a slip of paper fell out, fluttering to the ground. Marcus picked it up and froze, his eyes narrowing as he read the words. This is my dad's old address," he said, his voice filled with confusion and anger. "Why would she have this?" The officer took the paper and studied it before exchanging another glance with his partner. "It looks like there's more to this than we thought," he said grimly. "We're going to need to dig deeper." As the officers began packing up Patricia's belongings as evidence, James felt a sudden urgency. "Wait," he called out, stepping closer. "What's in the box?" The officer hesitated but opened it carefully. Inside were more photographs, but these weren't of the neighbors or their homes. They were of Patricia herself, standing with a man no one recognized. The photos were old, the edges frayed, but the faces were unmistakable. Monica leaned in, her breath hitching. "Who is that?" she asked. Patricia, now visibly shaking, refused to answer. But Marcus stepped closer, his expression darkening as he studied the man in the photos. That's the man who harassed my dad when we first moved here," he said slowly. "He used to drive by our house, yell slurs, make threats. My dad always said he was the reason we had to leave." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Patricia's connection to this man, combined with her obsessive behavior, painted a chilling picture. She wasn't just acting out of misguided caution, she was continuing a legacy of hate. James turned to the officer. "You have everything you need," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Please, make sure this stops here." The officer nodded, his expression resolute. "We will." As Patricia was finally driven away, the weight of the night began to lift. The neighbors turned to one another, their shared experiences forging a bond that hadn't existed before. For the first time, they saw each other not as strangers but as allies, united by their determination to stand against hate and fear. James and Monica walked back to their home, Ava nestled between them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, it felt possible. They had faced the worst and come out stronger, not just as a family but as part of a community willing to fight for what was right. But even as they closed their front door, a thought lingered in James's mind. The man in the photos, the one connected to Patricia, was still out there. And while Patricia's chapter had ended, another story might just be beginning. The night was quiet again, but beneath the surface, a new ripple had begun. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal in the days that followed, but the events of that unforgettable night left a lasting impact. The Carters found themselves at the center of a wave of support, as neighbors who had once seemed distant began reaching out. Some brought over baked goods or flowers, while others simply stopped by to say they were sorry for not speaking up sooner. For James and Monica, these gestures were small but meaningful signs that things were changing. Patricia's arrest became the talk of the town. Rumors swirled about what else the police might uncover in her files, but the Carters chose not to dwell on the details. Instead, they focused on rebuilding their sense of peace and stability. Monica took up gardening, transforming their backyard into a serene retreat. James, inspired by the outpouring of support from their neighbors, started organizing small community events to bring everyone closer together. One weekend, James stood in front of a crowd at a block party, holding a microphone. Ava played with some of the other kids nearby, her laughter filling the air. James glanced at Monica, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his voice steady but warm. "This neighborhood has seen its share of challenges, but I believe those challenges have brought us closer. What happened with Patricia was difficult for all of us, but it also showed us the power of standing together and speaking out against injustice." The crowd applauded, and James felt a swell of gratitude. He continued, "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. Let's keep building a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and welcome. That's something we can all be proud of." As the applause grew louder, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in months, he truly believed they had turned a corner. The neighborhood wasn't the only thing that had changed. Patricia's arrest and the revelations about her past became a catalyst for a broader conversation about accountability and healing. Local leaders organized forums to discuss issues of bias and discrimination, inviting residents to share their experiences and ideas for improvement. James and Monica attended every session, their voices adding to the call for change. One evening, as they walked home from one of these forums, Monica turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think she'll ever realize what she did?" she asked. James paused, considering the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whether she does or not, it's not about her anymore. It's about us and what we do moving forward." Monica smiled, slipping her hand into his. "I like the sound of that." Life settled into a new rhythm, one defined by connection and hope. The Carters found joy in simple moments, watching Ava ride her bike down the street, sharing dinners with neighbors who had become friends, and celebrating milestones together. The fear that had once loomed over them felt like a distant memory, replaced by a sense of belonging they had fought hard to achieve. Months later, James received a letter from Marcus. It was a heartfelt note thanking the Carters for their courage and sharing how much it had meant to him and his family. "You stood up not just for yourselves but for everyone who's ever felt unseen or unwelcome," Marcus wrote. "You reminded us that change is possible, and for that, I'll always be grateful." James read the letter aloud to Monica, who wiped away a tear. "That's the kind of legacy we want to leave," she said softly. And it was. The man in the photos remained a mystery, though the police assured the neighborhood they were investigating any potential connections. James and Monica decided not to let that shadow linger over their lives. They knew they couldn't control everything, but they could choose how they responded to the challenges that came their way. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James and Monica sat on their front porch, watching Ava chase fireflies in the yard. The air was warm and filled with the sounds of laughter and cicadas. "This is what it's all about," James said, his voice tinged with contentment. Monica nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It really is," she agreed. The road they had traveled had been long and difficult, but it had led them to a place of peace and purpose. They had faced adversity and come out stronger, not just as individuals but as a family and a community. And though the world wasn't perfect, they knew they had the power to make a difference, one step at a time. In the end, the story wasn't just about what had happened to them. It was about what they had built together, and the promise of what was still to come.